You're listening to Foodagogy, where we explore what food can teach us about becoming totally inclusive schools. I'm Angeline Aow, and I believe that dynamic conversations about inclusion, diversity, and equity happen around the table. Every episode, I sit down with someone whose relationship with food reveals something essential about identity, community, and belonging. The same things we're trying to cultivate in our classrooms. Whether you are wrestling with inclusion in your institution, a foodie, curious about culinary cultures, or simply someone who believes that every child deserves to thrive at school, you belong here. Thank you for tuning into these food-related conversations that nourish both heart and pedagogical practice. Let us fold in the stories, flavors, and truths of this episode's guest. So welcome, Sissi Chen, a Berlin-based food writer, content creator, and cookbook author, who is the person behind the popular Instagram channel called Eating in Berlin. Sissi was born in Beijing, raised in Yunnan and Vienna, and now rooted in Berlin. Sissi draws on her transnational journey really to share Chinese homestyle cooking while exploring themes of cultural identity, diaspora, and belonging. Her award-winning debut cookbook, Einfach Chinesisch, makes everyday Chinese recipes accessible in German kitchens. Through her work, Sissi uses food as a powerful medium for storytelling, challenging racism, fostering intercultural dialogue, and really, I'm admiring how you're able to reclaim narratives and create spaces for authentic representation and connection across cultures. So I'm very happy to have you on our podcast today. So tell us more about you, Sissi. Share with us your earliest food memories.
So I was born in Beijing, and I feel like if you are born in China, you have a very direct contact with food in terms of that you just tag along with whatever happens, whatever meals, whatever people are doing, whatever your family is cooking, whatever their family is buying and getting from the market, getting aware of food, getting aware of meat and dairy, getting aware of that these were animals before they were basically killed for consumption. And since it's such a collective culture and we don't cook by recipe, we don't necessarily learn in the way that a lot of Western countries learn. We just learn by observing and then just basically mimicking or just, remembering things and just trying out stuff. I think that's how I would describe my first contact with food. It's just very taste based, very action based in terms of I think every Chinese kid can make dumplings by the age of 3 or something. So I feel like it's a very early contact with food that you have that is very different than how I observe, for example, now living in Berlin. In China, we don't have like child menus or like kids menus. That's such a absurd thing to me. And I think my first contacts with food were very raw in that sense.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And what I'm hearing is that like you are from a very young age very much aware of where food comes from
Yeah.
and also the process of making food. And it was also not just at mealtime, but it was like
Yeah.
I know in the Chinese language quite often we say like, have you eaten instead of how are
Mm-hmm.
you? And
Mm-hmm.
so we're always thinking about the next meal,
Yes,
and thinking
exactly.
about that. And it becomes like a shared experience that you have as a family to go shopping and then
Exactly.
preparing together and really in a way that honors the produce
Yeah.
that you have and the
Yeah.
connection with that, but as a whole. And so, having things on the bone is so different sometimes
Mm-hmm.
to some cultures, like, for example, where we are based here in Berlin and Germany
Yes.
and in Western Europe, where you can buy so many things filleted already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You have I feel like as if you grew up in a lot of countries that still go to the market and buy meat in a very, exposed way, you are just very quickly exposed to food in a very different way. So you understand that the chicken that's on your table Also because most of the time the chicken is not stripped to the fillet, it's a whole chicken. So I feel like you understand, oh, okay, that was a chicken. Then you understand a lot of times how produce look like before they were cooked, and you understand the change of structure. Because I feel like if you go to supermarket, things are packed up, right? Things are already packed up in the way how you a lot of things are so packed up that you don't need to even wash it anymore. You just dump it. If they are pre-chopped, pre-cooked, you just dump it basically in your pan. And in terms of understanding food, not as something that you get from the supermarket, but understanding food as something that people really grow. And in China, there's a thing, and this goes so much into the topic of food waste. I cannot waste food because every single time, even like rice, every single time I think of food waste, there's this thing that in Chinese culture we tell our children that like every single grain of rice, there's someone in the rice field standing in the midday heat and picking up rice with their hands. And it's such a labor intense work. So even seeing rice, I see the rice fields and the labor and the work that goes into it. And I don't know how much of that you have when you grew up in a country that basically sells things more packed up and give it to you already basically cleaned, perfectly shaped, beautifully packed. And I feel like that's definitely a huge difference compared to how I grew up.
It sounds like a deep respect for food. And what you said resonated with me as well about not wasting food. I grew up in a household where if there was one leftover bit of chicken wing, you would still wrap it up
Mhm.
and put it in the fridge.
Yes, yes,
Like the-
absolutely. So there's a lot of other aspects of food that really goes into one single topic, but it really is connected to how you see and view food, and from not only from the purist side but then food waste, and then the question of consuming animals, and then the question of how to use resources the best. Yeah, for example, I remember in China, one of the favorite things that my grandpa used to eat is fish head, and he really loved fish head, like fish head curry and fish head stew, and he loved to nibble on the fish head. And for me, that's something very normal, and I find it really weird that you only get fish fillet here. And for me, that's not only something that is about not wasting the part of the fish that I find is delicious, but also making it something that's actually delicious and something that people almost see like a delicacy, if you want. And maybe you can learn with time, but I feel like for me, it's really, really natural to see, oh, I can use the tongue of the cow to do a cold salad. I can use the ears of a pig to do a salad. I can use the fish head for soup. So you basically learn by not wasting food, but then also there are so many different layers that you learn that is not only about not wasting food, but understanding cooking, understanding the animal, understanding produce, understanding techniques.
I love that. What you've described made me think about how certain cultures can be revered in
Mm-hmm.
terms of how they treat product,
Mm-hmm.
and then others it's looked down on as something that might
Yes.
be like considered, oh, can't believe you eat that. Like when you
Yeah.
talk about pig ear salad,
Yeah.
it's so common, or having chicken feet, it's a
Yeah.
very common part of Chinese culture to
It
do
is.
that. Whereas like if I spoke to my mother or father about eating snails, they would be like,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh no, they wouldn't do that,"
Yeah.
right? And when I think of trends of cooking and certain very popular restaurants
Mm-hmm.
that are getting stars and awards and things
Mm-hmm.
are like, "Yeah, we are a head to toe, use all the product,"
Mm.
and then all of
Yeah.
a sudden it's fashionable
Yeah.
and not not considered to be to be othered and seen as lower, but
Yeah.
seen as like something, wow, you're using all the
Yeah.
product. But doing that is actually a part of steep histories of food cultures that have always done that, and
Exactly.
but all
Yeah.
of a sudden, yeah. So what are your thoughts about that kind of big gap? And it can be
Mm-hmm.
quite polarizing.
Yeah. It's a huge topic that, yeah, I feel very conflicted about that, because obviously when chefs come up with those type of concepts like from nose to tail, I see a whitewashing of something that has been happening in other cultures for many years, but people never acknowledged that. People never celebrated that. They always looked down on that. And then taking something that people look down upon and make a marketing concept out of it and then sell it again for a lot of money to a certain audience, it just makes me feel uncomfortable. And especially working in food, I get confronted with that almost every single day. It's really taking away not only the cultural heritage from other people, but making it a profit, I think is the thing that irks me even more because you already did something that I think wasn't okay. And then you're making profit out of it without giving back to the community. It's just so wrong on so many levels. I'm not per se against it, but I think the it really depends on how you do it. And it's really for me, it's a case by case decision if I feel like that person has appropriated a culture of food, or if I feel like that person has a business selling something from a different culture but actually understands it, really always talks about the background, the history, the ingredients. So there's a huge difference in, I think, how people do it. And also another thing that I find really difficult working in food and, with a cultural difference is how, especially living in Berlin and Europe, we're so close to French and Italian cuisine being the non plus ultra, being the highest standard of how everyone in the world should cook, and their cooking techniques being the best of the best and the most awarded in the world. And it just doesn't fit at all for so many other cuisines. I think a lot of countries in Asia, we have very different standards in terms of food, and we have so many different cooking techniques and chopping techniques and braising and cooking with whatever coal and in under pressure, and such a rich culture in cooking techniques, but nobody here knows about it. So it's very difficult. And I think a lot of the, or most of the people who are in Europe and in Germany who are working in food who don't have like a migrant background or come from a country that is outside of Europe or come from an ethnic cuisine, I think they don't understand how hard it is actually for people with migrant background and people who are working gastronomy and cooking their food basically from a different country, from a different tradition and roots and heritage, how difficult it is to be as successful because there's just so many discriminations that those people have to work against. And it's someone opening up a Vietnamese restaurant has to work double as hard as someone opening a Italian restaurant because it's just not as well known, it's not well accepted. And then we go into the topic of authenticity, which is such a difficult topic because people from who cook ethnic cuisines, they are most of the time put into like a space where they're only allowed to cook the food from their country because that's what people expect. They expect authentic food. So if that person who grew up between two or three cultures cooks something that is authentic to them, but maybe has a twist because that's just how they grew up, it's just not accepted. It will not be as successful because it's not authentic. So there's so much that basically goes hand in hand in that whole system of gastronomy and cultural foods.
Yeah, and we kind of have come a little bit full circle to where you started earlier when you were talking about, cultural appropriation
Mhm.
versus cultural appreciation,
Mhm.
which is why I think I'm also in awe and admiration of you and your recent cookbook, which was published because your cookbook really emphasizes making Chinese home cooking accessible, and you've published it in German.
Yes.
And so, which was great because I could then give it to my husband and say, there's no excuses now for not being able to, because he's German. But how do you then balance that authenticity
Yeah.
and adaptability? Because, your own identity has
Mhm.
been influenced by your migrant story
Yeah.
and also your personal reinterpretation of the cultural wealth that you've inherited and the recipes that you now share to the world.
Yeah. So I definitely struggle with that because how do I write a book about Chinese food when knowing that there's not one version of things? And I think that's why it was really important for me to dedicate one page in a book to the word authenticity and what does it even mean, or even just raise awareness when people browse through to be like, oh, I've used that word, just I really like using that word, but maybe now that you mention it, there's definitely a point to think about how I use it and don't just use it as a synonym, for example, for good food. Because authentic food doesn't always is the best food, because there's a lot of traditional Beijing food that I don't like and I think it's very acquired taste. So for me the it was difficult to really write a book and call it einfach Chinesisch, knowing that Chinesisch is basically a word that represents 56 ethnic minorities and a country that is just vastly different from east to west, from south to north. So for me, I think I based my Chinese cooking, and I wrote that in the beginning of the book, based out that on my experience, basically how I grew up eating, which is very much heavily North Chinese inspired, with a lot of dough-based produce like noodles, dumplings, flatbreads. So basically anything that is somehow dough-based is very North Chinese. So that's a big chunk of the book is those kind of recipes. And then I also write that for me growing up, when we moved to Vienna, it wasn't at that time there wasn't a lot of Asian supermarkets. So a lot of ingredients were not accessible. So we had to bring them back basically every time when we visited in China. We basically brought them back with us in the suitcase. And then at the same time, I also try to tell people that my understanding of authentic or authenticity also involves being creative and working with things that are available. So I like to write things in like, if you don't have wheat noodles, really don't worry, use spaghetti. And I feel like there's a way to honor authenticity or your heritage and the tradition by understanding where are the elements that I knew from China and that I think most of the Chinese people would agree upon as the ingredients and the condiments that needs to be in that dish, but where are the parts and what are the parts that are flexible. So I think I try to explain in that way that the recipes are still in the core itself very much authentic, in the way that that's how Chinese people or my family in China, how we would cook it and we would eat it. But then there's also some flexibility around it. And if you don't have that, it also it doesn't matter if your version isn't authentic anymore. I think if you understand how it was meant to be, but then also at the same time are flexible and acknowledging the culture, but you change it out a little bit for your own taste, I think that's totally fine.
It sounds like that adaptability also comes from a desire to, because everyone makes a dish and then personalizes it
Mhm.
for whatever reason
Mhm.
that you might have, and a huge part is also because of accessibility to
Yeah,
resources, right? And
exactly.
so like if you can't find a certain ingredient, don't limit yourself from trying to make what's in the cookbook, but adapt and think
Exactly.
about which ingredients can be substituted, but you're keeping the cultural wealth and honoring it, but at the same time recognizing that for the wealth to spread in certain spaces, one will need to make it accessible
Yep.
and to explain then to which aspects are unique to this culture and we should honor, but which aspects, we can be flex on.
Mhm. Exactly. And I think a lot of times people view non authentic food as something that's bad or something that's worse than authentic food. But for me, whenever I see, for example, a very typical German Chinese dish, use this sweet sour pork, sweet sour, whatever, it's a very German sweet sour. And I find it still delicious. It's mostly sugar, to be honest, but I find it still delicious, often served with something crispy fried, right? And I think like when I see those kind of dishes, I see the history and the people behind it. I don't see the dish as something that, oh, it's not the real thing. I see the story of the first Chinese people coming to Germany. They didn't have access to ingredients, but they had to make a living. They had to adapt. They had to be resilient and really be creative and think outside of their box and really make something out of it, make something out of the ingredients that they had. So for me, that reflects so much. And I see really all the people who had the courage to open a Chinese restaurant when no one knew about Chinese food and had the courage to cook Chinese food, adapted to a foreign palate that they also didn't know. And then they were the first ones that made the Chinese restaurants now as successful as they are. Because without them, we wouldn't be there. Like, we wouldn't be in a Berlin where we finally have like malatang, we have hand-pulled noodles, we have really good Sichuan food. And without those people, we wouldn't, I think, have the audience as ready as they are to embrace maybe more cultural differences in Chinese food and embrace more different dishes. So yeah, yeah,
Yeah, because I think also cultures change over time.
yes,
Right? And they evolve. I mean, I grew up in Chinatown of Sydney where something like guluyok, like sweet and sour pork
yeah,
was really like this classic dish. And
yeah,
whether it was authentically brought over from, Hong Kong Cantonese kitchens,
yeah,
or whether it has been made for a more kind of Western oriented palate,
mm-hmm,
it has become a classic of its own,
yeah,
and when you talked about things that some people may not be flex on, it's the same with cultures in general. There are things that some people have, like things we value, things that we think are at our core,
mm-hmm,
and but there are some things that we can be flex on. So, for
yes,
example, what might be some core values for me is I value inclusion, I
mm-hmm,
value family, but some things I might be flex on. I don't mind if for me I don't have a more flexible view on time, perhaps.
mm-hmm.
Like a lot of Germans will be like, you have to get on time, and if not, then you have to contact me. And I'm like, oh, I think there's a half-hour buffer,
Yeah,
like it's so. And whereas, so it depends on who you are
yeah,
and how you view certain values. And I
that's
think,
true.
and I think through your work, Sissy, you've highlighted also how food can serve as that intercultural bridge.
Mm-hmm,
And you've also spoken out about experiencing anti-Chinese racism,
mm-hmm,
because you're not only a cookbook author, but obviously a media personality.
mm-hmm,
And there was an incident specifically during a radio interview where
yeah,
you were asked if you eat dog,
yeah,
and obviously the broader issues of stereotypes around Chinese food and the everyday racism that we're
yeah,
supposed to take as a joke, came up as well. So if you don't mind sharing and describing how that situation kind of unfolded, and the
mm-hmm,
responses you got, and what you hope you to see as a change
mm-hmm.
in the industry.
Yeah, it was Chinese New Year this year, and I get a lot of like invitations for interviews or TV or as an expert to talk about certain topics in Chinese food or in food in general. And that radio interview was a live interview. It's just supposed to be 5 minutes and really just a light-hearted interview to quickly talk about the Chinese New Year and the customs and the culture and the food part of it, right? So I don't usually prepare that much because usually I those questions are really things that I like to talk about. So and then he asked what are the traditions about Chinese New Year and told him that, well, it's the biggest thing in China and a lot of so many millions of people are not able to see their family because they just work like miles away, right, in a different city. And Chinese New Year is really that one thing in the year where families come together. It's the biggest human migration in the entire world. And then he wanted to ask me about the Chinese foods that I miss. And I almost started answering that question, but then he made a really weird joke about let's not talk about the dogs. And you can really hear me pausing for 3 seconds. And then I ask him, can you repeat that? And then he repeat the question but didn't include the joke. And then because I'm raised, a very Chinese Asian way where you try to contribute to harmony and don't cause too much trouble. So I just really finished the interview in a very nice manner. And then I realized after I finished that interview that it wasn't okay. It wasn't actually okay. And I felt really stupid that I agreed to do that live interview to talk about my culture and give people some insights. And, it was something that I really looked forward to because whenever I get a chance to talk to in a mass media about Chinese culture and maybe educate people on a lot of misinformation and a lot of stereotypes and also racist stereotypes, I'm just like, yeah, I will do it because I think it's necessary. And I was really looking forward. And then I think being confronted on that live interview with this racist stereotype typical thing, I felt really, really sad. And then I got really angry and also sad at the same time. And then I really try to see a situation from different perspectives and give the people the benefit of the doubt. But then I think what really made me angry is someone from that radio station called me and he said, I don't know the exact words, but he just basically blamed me for overreacting. And he's like, what do you expect from us? Because our moderators, they have creative freedom to, do their work. And that really, really made me angry because I think I wish that people would just take accountability for when things like that happen, because it doesn't mean that just because you say something racist doesn't mean you're the biggest racist person, right? Because obviously I can also say something racist without knowing, and I can take accountability and say, I really didn't know, it was my mistake, I'm really, really sorry for what happened. I think it's really, really important that you as a company get some cultural education on cultural sensitivity and anti-racism education. And I think it really, really is necessary because RB is a very German company. And I think that will be my feedback, and I will be like, okay, you apologize, you understood and acknowledge that something wrong happened, but exactly the opposite happened. So that made me even more angry. And that's when I decided to make it public, because usually I'm not that person who just makes things public. And then I didn't expect so many people to jump into that conversation and really give me the validation and really acknowledge that what I felt was completely in my right and that was not okay to do that on live radio interview. And but the thing is, equally you have the same people doing the exact opposite thing, right? So especially if you are in media, you're exposed to anyone, you show vulnerability in whatever way, you will attract the the people who are going to support you, and you will attract the people who are not going to support you. And then you have all the hateful comments and adding more and re-triggering your experience. And that's really, really tough. And that's also one of the reasons why I usually don't share so much. I used to share a lot more about those kind of topics, but now I don't do it anymore because people don't have filters anymore. I always say that also I am definitely someone who had racist thoughts and had internalized racism, and I am living in that structure, and I am still learning every single day what is okay and what is hurtful. And I mean, in the end of the day, it's your decision to say things or don't say things, right? So nobody is like protected from not being racist, but it doesn't make you like the big bad person. You have to just take accountability for that. So that's something that I really, really hope for everyone, because I think that's the only logical, sensible way to move on. And a lot of people, because a lot of the comments from people that didn't understood it, everyone commented, a lot of them commented, well, it's true that people eat dog in China, but that's not what it is about. And I know that it's a thing, but it's also a thing in other Asian countries. But understanding what the sentence means and understanding the reference to basically putting down people and making them look barbaric because they eat dogs, humans' best friends, this is the the problem with that. And I think that's a huge part where people that I realize that people who are very negative about my reaction, that they still didn't understand. Whenever I go outside and people like tell me, oh, look at her walking her lunch or having her lunch in her arms, because I had a tiny dog at one time. I was in a building and I carried that dog, and there was like two elderly couple looking at me, and he said to his wife, oh, look, she's carrying her lunch. And I know that those type of things have happened, so there's a certain tension in my body because I already expect that. And I just wish that people would understand what it does to those minorities or group of people. It's not about necessarily about what, like, exactly factually what has been said, but what is connected to what are you saying and why are you saying it? Because obviously you're saying it to make a joke out of it, but why are you making a joke out of it? Like, what's the idea behind it? What's the structure? What's the system behind it? And I just wish that more people would educate themselves and really take their time and just empathize, I guess, in the end of the day. Maybe empathize, yeah. Because I feel like in the end of the day, it's really about, do I want to hurt someone or not willingly, right? So, yeah, that was a really unfortunate incident.
Well, I'm very grateful that you very open and vulnerably shared the story with us, how there's a lack of accountability there for
Hmm.
someone who was a perpetrator of racism,
Yeah.
and to a fact where you then, not only had to work yourself through a space where you started by blaming yourself for the incident.
Hmm.
Why did I choose to do this? And that internalized racism is so ingrained, and actually also, like, when we talked earlier about all the messages that go out in the media, and it's
Hmm.
because of these casual things that have an audience of so many people, that then someone who is walking past you in an apartment building feels empowered and entitled to repeat those messages. To speak out against that, Sissy, was an act of bravery, because
Yeah.
it always comes with a risk. Like, you risk, the work that you have done and the competencies you have built in the industry as someone who can speak authentically to, not only about food but as a media personality, etc. And the platforms in which they have power over inviting you and not inviting you,
Hmm.
it's a risk to speak this truth to power. And I hope that this will then help people to learn from that as you continue to do all the great things that you do to bridge across cultures, not only through food, but through the work that you do. So I thank you so much for sharing. And I just have a couple of closing questions that I ask
Yes.
all of my guests. And the first one is, what is your go to comfort food?
It's either noodles or dumplings. It's really those two things that I grew up with. And I would say dumplings probably, because it just really feels very, very familiar and it's delicious and I can eat it every single day. Yeah.
Is there a specific type of dumpling that you would?
I think the really just the most basic traditional North Chinese version where you just use, so mostly it's pork, but I use a beef. And it's really just minced meat, garlic, green onions, some light seasoning, and then boiled. So we in North China we eat them boiled, and then you can just boil a lot of like 10, 15 pieces at once, and then it's a full meal.
Amazing. And Sissy, last question. If you were to cook for someone you treasure, what
Mhm.
would you have on the menu and why?
I It will be dumplings again, to be honest. Yeah, it would be dumplings again, but I think I would really do like my childhood dishes, which are really comforting but also simple and quick. So I would do dumplings, but then obviously I would also make a meal out of it. So I would cook rice, and then I think the number one dish that every Chinese person would say that's the most nostalgic dish is tomato egg stir fry. It's really just the one dish. So I think I would make tomato egg stir fry.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time and your vulnerability and sharing your stories. And I really appreciate it. Thank you, Sissi Chen, for sharing your food memories, your courage, and your vulnerability around what it means to be authentic, and for showing us how speaking truth to power can quietly change the cultural conversation. Sissi's debut cookbook, Einfach Chinesisch, is available now, making everyday Chinese home cooking accessible to German-speaking kitchens everywhere. You can find her website and across all social media platforms as Eating in Berlin on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. All links are in the show notes. Before you go, what's one idea from this conversation you're taking back to enhance your practice? Maybe it's reflecting on how casual remarks, even well-intentioned ones, can carry the weight of a much longer history of racism or other forms of discrimination. Or perhaps you're taking away how you can enhance safeguarding practices by addressing and holding people to account for identity-based harm. Be sure to engage with the Foodagogy Transfers resource, share this episode with a colleague who needs to hear it, and connect with me on LinkedIn. We release new episodes every couple of weeks during the school year, so subscribe and follow Foodagogy to stay informed. Until next time, keep making space at the table for every story. I'm Angeline Aow. 谢谢. Herzlichen Dank. Thank you for tuning in to Foodagogy. Foodagogy is produced by EKG Collective, with editing by Jitani Heveo and Kirk McDavitt. Music by Paul Romain and artwork by Svi David. Special thanks to Trisha Friedman and Frank Jung for sharing podcasting expertise and encouraging the birth of Foodagogy.